So let me ask you a couple of questions that struck me as sort of bizarre. How is it, and my understanding is that the gap with Gillum is still closing, and we had somebody call in last night who said that the new Florida licenses that were issued apparently did not scan by the voting machines, when they signed in to vote.
Cool. Good democracy.
And that all those people were given provisional ballots. Because of some screw up with the 3D imprint on the Florida licenses. Now, I haven't confirmed that.
Florida gonna Florida.
But if it's the case that there are a lot of provisional ballots and Gillum, counts, maybe, I don't know, maybe it becomes closer. Maybe we'll see. But how do you reconcile the idea that Amendment 4, which reenfranchises 1.5 million felons, overwhelmingly passed in Florida, but DeSantis looks like he won. How do you square those two things?
I'm not sure that came across. That was just kind of like a sigh. Provisional ballots are important. They do flip elections sometimes. Democrats at this point, especially in races like states like Georgia, rather, and Florida, are pretty good now at chasing people who had election day problems, and if they had provisional ballots, going after them. So that is why I think you have not seen a call in the Florida Senate race, for example. That's why there's a couple of races I think they're not going to be resolved for weeks. And if this is something that I think Democrats, you're going to have a discussion from some of the House Democrats about introducing a bill that would not pass, but would bring national attention to voting reform to solve this problem. Because Brian Kemp might end up winning this election after running it pretty badly. The two issues that I think Democrats have begun to highlight as kind of good government issues are voter integrity and gerrymandering. And on both of those, when gerrymandering was on the ballot this year, it got completely wiped out. In Missouri, in Michigan, we're waiting on Utah, but in at least two states, people voted against gerrymandering. I think there's probably a electoral majority for how about we don't make people stand in line for 5 hours? How about we don't screw up the voting machines, et cetera? But Democrats have not, the last time they had power, they didn't do a ton on that issue, and I think they've gotten scared straight since then.
All right. Well, I'm sorry. So I had two questions. That were rolled in there. One was just sort of leading in about maybe the chance that Gillum may picked up. But how do you square the Fourth Amendment in Florida winning, or I should say Amendment 4 or whatever? I can't remember winning so easily, and Gillum losing. Like, how do you? Does that make sense to you? Can you explain that?
I can very easily. So this is like a great little game theory question because on the one hand, the stakes were very high to win the governor's race in Florida. On the other hand, the stakes were high maybe for generations to get this amendment passed. And in Florida, you need 60% of the vote to pass a constitutional amendment. So there was a decision made by the people behind that amendment not to make it super partisan. Now, Andrew Gillum was for it. Ron DeSantis was against it. I believe Rick Scott was against it. Certainly, Rick Scott probably personally denied enough felons' rights to get him the lead he has right now. But they kind of kept Republican big money on the sidelines by not turning this into a partisan cause. And the people behind Amendment 4 very, very cleverly got Coke money, some Republican criminal justice reform money. They kept them on board with this as we can all agree on this good government reform, and so they didn't yoke the Democrats to that. And had they, it's hard to say what would have happened. So in Ohio, you had a ballot measure that failed on criminal justice reform, and the statewide Democratic ticket failed. In Florida, all you needed was this thing to get 59% of the vote, and you would have lost your best chance, perhaps ever, to change that law. So I think it was a strategic decision. And, but for 100,000 votes in Florida, we're not even asking about it.
I mean,
we're saying, oh, it was brilliant of them to do this. Yeah.
That's amazing, right? I mean, because it also suggests that, like, when you do have races, these special elections, when all the Democrats pour in their national money, that may be counterproductive because you are sort of like triggering, like everybody, like it's like the electorate now has this sort of latent virus that can be triggered by environmental changes. And once the environment changes, they turn into, everything becomes super tribal.
No, it's not just that, but imagine if the president had just tweeted at the start of early voting, I don't know, maybe getting the Trump voice here, Florida Amendment 4 is a disgrace, would bring criminals to our streets, vote against it for the troops, something like that. Right. If the president had, used his campaign megaphone to say vote against this, and that had flipped 200,000 votes, that would have been the ball game. So they had to be very careful about this, and that's just a quirk of the way Florida amends its constitution, which to me is not the craziest idea. I think getting 60% of the votes probably good. I mean, North Carolina passed a couple of bad amendments now with 55% of the vote. So that was just the way that they decided to build the campaign around this.
And how do you explain, let's say, like Ohio?